On October 7, 1780, a British officer stood on a rocky ridge in South Carolina. He was considered one of the finest soldiers in the entire British Army. He had never lost a battle. He had trained over 1,000 soldiers personally. And he was completely certain that nobody could touch him. He was wrong. 65 minutes later, he was dead. His entire army was destroyed. And the men who destroyed him had no uniforms, no formal training, no orders from any government or military commander. They were farmers, hunters, mountain men, who had crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains on foot, in the rain, with nothing but their long rifles and a deep, burning fury to protect their families. This is the story of the Battle of Kings Mountain, the battle that most Americans have never heard of, and the battle that saved the American Revolution in 65 minutes. To understand this battle, we must understand how desperate the American situation was. By the summer of 1780, the American Revolution in the South was effectively over. The British had completely changed their strategy. After years of indecisive warfare in the northern colonies, the British decided to take the war south. Their thinking was simple. The southern colonies were full of loyalists, people who still supported King George, and who would fight alongside the British if given the chance. All Britain had to do was march south, crush whatever resistance they found, and let the loyalists handle the rest. For a while, it worked. In May 1780, British General Clinton sailed south with over 14,000 troops. His target was Charleston, South Carolina, the wealthiest city in the southern colonies. Clinton surrounded the city by land and sea, cutting off every possible escape. On May 12th, the American commander surrendered the entire garrison. 5,000 Continental soldiers, captured in a single stroke. It was the single largest American military surrender of the entire war. The British now owned the South. Then came Camden. In August 1780, the British met the remaining American forces in South Carolina. The American militia broke and ran almost immediately. The Continental soldiers who stood and fought were overwhelmed. Nearly 1,000 Americans were killed or captured. The American general himself fled the battlefield on horseback and did not stop riding for 60 miles. After Camden, organized American resistance in the South completely collapsed. There was no Continental Army left below Virginia. The Revolution in the South looked dead. This is where Patrick Ferguson enters the story. Ferguson was a 36-year-old Scottish officer, ambitious, skilled, ruthless. He had been given command of the Loyalist militia forces, operating on the western flank of the British advance. His job was to recruit Loyalists, arm them, train them, and use them to crush rebel activity in the Carolina back country. Ferguson was exceptionally good at this job. He moved fast through the foothills, striking Patriot homesteads and supply depots, before local militia could organize a response. He gave rebel sympathizers a simple choice: swear loyalty to the crown, or watch your farm burn. For months, this approach worked. Fence-sitters fell in line. Patriot sympathizers hid or fled west. Ferguson's reputation as an unstoppable force grew with every passing week. But in late September 1780, Ferguson made the mistake that would cost him everything. He sent a message across the mountains, a threat, to the one group of people who did not respond to threats the way he expected. West of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the remote settlements along the rivers of what is now eastern Tennessee, lived a collection of frontier families. They were called the Overmountain Men. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, hunters, and Indian fighters. They had carved their existence out of the wilderness. They answered to no colonial government. Many of them had ignored the entire revolution up to this point. Ferguson knew about these settlements. He considered them a potential threat to his western flank. So he sent a paroled prisoner across the mountains, carrying a message for the Overmountain settlers. The message was direct. If the settlers did not stop their opposition to the crown, Ferguson would cross the mountains himself, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their settlements, with fire and sword. Ferguson intended this threat to intimidate. Instead, it did the exact opposite. The Overmountain Men took it as a declaration of war, and they decided to deal with Ferguson before Ferguson could deal with them. Word of the threat spread through the mountain settlements, like a fire through dry grass. Colonel Isaac Shelby, a 29-year-old militia leader, rode immediately to the home of Colonel John Sevier. He had a simple proposition. Rather than wait for Ferguson to come to them, they would gather every fighting man they could find and go after Ferguson first. Sevier agreed on the spot. Within days, riders went out across the mountains, carrying the call to muster. On September 25, 1780, the Overmountain Men gathered at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. They came from settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Some rode horses, some walked. Some brought their own rifles and powder. Others had almost nothing. Roughly 1,000 men assembled over 2 days. They were led by a collection of colonels, none of whom technically outranked the others, and none of whom had been authorized by any government to do what they were about to do. Colonel William Campbell brought 400 Virginians. Colonel Isaac Shelby brought 240 men. Colonel John Sevier brought another 240. Colonel Charles McDowell brought about 160 men, who had already been driven from their homes by Ferguson's loyalists. There was no formal chain of command, no supply line, no artillery, no plan beyond one simple objective: find Patrick Ferguson and destroy him. Before they marched, a Presbyterian minister addressed the gathered men. He ended his sermon with words from the Old Testament, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The men took it as their battle cry. Then they crossed the mountains. The march through the Blue Ridge was brutal. The Overmountain Men rode and walked through mountain passes. In late September rain and early autumn cold, the trails were narrow, muddy, and steep. Some paths were little more than animal traces through virgin forest. They had no tents. They carried what food they could, mostly dried corn and dried meat. Some men had no shoes. They slept on the ground in their hunting shirts, soaked to the skin, with no fires for warmth because the wood was too wet to burn. But they kept moving. Nobody turned back. As they pushed east, more fighters joined them. Colonel Benjamin Cleveland arrived with 350 more men from North Carolina. By October 6th, the combined Patriot force had grown to roughly 1,400 men. But they had a problem. Ferguson was moving, and they were not entirely sure where he was. That evening, The Patriot colonels held a quick council of war. They made a bold decision. They selected 900 of their best horsemen, the fastest riders on the strongest horses, and sent them ahead through the night. The rest would follow as quickly as they could. The 900 would ride through the darkness, close the distance, and find Ferguson before he could escape. It was a gamble. The night ride was miserable. It rained steadily. Trails turned to mud. Men fell asleep on their horses and were jolted awake when their mounts stumbled. Some riders fell off entirely and had to catch up on foot. But nobody turned back. By dawn on October 7th, a captured loyalist gave them the information they needed. Ferguson had made camp on a ridge called King's Mountain, 16 miles away. The 900 exhausted riders pushed forward one final time, and by early afternoon, they had found him. King's Mountain was not much of a mountain. It rose about 60 feet above the surrounding terrain. Stretched roughly 600 yards in length, the top was relatively flat, covered with hardwood trees and thick underbrush on every slope. Ferguson had chosen this position because he believed it was defensible. He reportedly told his officers that he was on King's Mountain, that he could not be driven from it, and that God Almighty himself could not drive him from it. He was very wrong. The position he had chosen was in reality a death trap. The Patriot colonels looked at the mountain. They had no elaborate plan. They simply agreed to surround the mountain from all sides and attack uphill simultaneously. Each colonel would lead his men up a different section of the slope. When they reached the top, they would converge on Ferguson's position. At roughly 3:15 in the afternoon, the attack began. The Overmountain Men moved through the trees, like hunters stalking game, because that is exactly what they were. These were men who had spent their lives hunting deer, elk, and bear in the Appalachian wilderness. They understood cover. They understood how to move quietly through dense forest, and they were carrying long rifles, the most accurate individual weapon in the Western world. A skilled rifleman could hit a target at 200 yards or more. Ferguson's loyalists were armed primarily with smoothbore muskets, accurate to perhaps 80 yards. The mathematics of the battle were devastating before the first shot was ever fired. The Patriots came up from multiple directions simultaneously. Shelby's men hit the southern slope. Sevier's men attacked from the north. Campbell's Virginians charged up the northeastern end. Cleveland's men stormed the southwestern approach. Rifle fire erupted from every direction at once. Ferguson's loyalists responded exactly as they had been trained. They formed lines and launched bayonet charges downhill. And at first, the charges worked. The Overmountain Men had no bayonets. When a wall of screaming loyalists came crashing downhill with fixed steel, the frontiersmen fell back into the trees. But they did not break. They did not run. They simply melted into the forest, reloaded, and came back up. Every time Ferguson's men charged downhill, they gained ground temporarily, but they exposed themselves to rifle fire from the other sides of the mountain. The Patriots on the opposite slopes poured fire into the Loyalists as they advanced. Then the Loyalists would turn and charge that direction, and the men they had just pushed back would creep up the hill behind them again. It was like trying to push water uphill. Every charge solved one problem. and created 3 more. Ferguson rode back and forth across the hilltop on horseback, blowing a silver whistle to rally his men, personally leading counterattacks wherever the line seemed weakest. He was conspicuously brave, wearing a checkered hunting shirt over his uniform. That made him impossible to miss. Several Patriot riflemen later said they had deliberately targeted the officer on horseback. Ferguson had his sword shot from his hand. He kept fighting. A rifle ball cut his sash. He kept rallying his men. Another ball struck his hat. He replaced it and kept riding. The Loyalists were being pushed into a tighter and tighter perimeter. White flags began to appear. Ferguson would not allow it. Every time a white flag went up, Ferguson personally rode over and cut it down with his sword. He refused to surrender. To men he called a band of bandits, and so the killing continued. Then, around 4 in the afternoon, Ferguson made his last decision. He gathered a few officers and attempted to break through the Patriot lines on horseback, charging downhill, sword raised, whistle blowing. He never made it. Multiple rifle balls struck him almost simultaneously. His foot caught in his stirrup as he fell, and his horse dragged his body across the rocky ground. Before coming to a stop, Patrick Ferguson, the finest marksman in the British Army, the man who had threatened to lay waste to the mountains, was dead. With Ferguson gone, the remaining Loyalist officers raised the white flag for the final time. The Battle of King's Mountain was over. From the first shot to the last, the entire engagement had lasted 65 minutes. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Ferguson's force of approximately 1,100 men suffered 290 killed, 163 wounded, and 668 taken prisoner. The total Loyalist casualties amounted to the entire army. Every single man, killed, wounded, or captured. Not one organized unit escaped. The Patriot losses: 28 killed and 62 wounded. 900 untrained frontier farmers had surrounded a fortified hilltop position, attacked uphill from every direction, and annihilated the entire enemy force in just over an hour, while losing fewer than 100 men themselves. The Battle of King's Mountain was over, and its effects rippled outward immediately. When Lord Cornwallis received word of Ferguson's destruction, he was stunned. He had been preparing to march north through North Carolina, continuing his campaign to take the southern colonies one by one. Ferguson's force had been protecting his entire western flank. Now that flank was gone. Along with 1,100 trained soldiers he could not replace, Cornwallis immediately halted his advance. He retreated south to winter quarters and stayed there for nearly 3 months. The momentum of the entire British Southern campaign, which had seemed completely unstoppable after Charleston and Camden, stopped overnight. For the first time in months, the British were going backward. Loyalist recruitment across the Carolinas collapsed almost immediately. Men who had been considering fighting for the crown looked at what happened at King's Mountain and quietly stayed home. The Loyalist militia network, that the entire British Southern strategy depended on, began to fall apart. At the same time, Patriot morale surged across the South. After months of nothing but catastrophic defeats, King's Mountain proved that the British could not just be slowed, they could be completely destroyed. The 3 months that Kings Mountain cost Cornwallis were 3 months the American cause desperately needed. Those 3 months allowed Congress to appoint a new Southern commander, General Nathaniel Greene, who began the slow, brilliant campaign that would eventually bleed Cornwallis dry and force him north into Virginia, to a small tobacco port called Yorktown, where the Revolution ended exactly 1 year after Kings Mountain. Thomas Jefferson later called this battle the turn of the tide of success in the South. He was right, and it was won, not by generals, not by governments, not by a professional army. It was won by farmers, by hunters, by mountain men who had been threatened and refused to be afraid. They gathered themselves, crossed the mountains in the rain, and destroyed a professional British force in 65 minutes. There is a quiet stone monument at Kings Mountain today. A small marker shows where Patrick Ferguson fell. The forest is peaceful now, but standing on that ridge, among those old trees, you can feel what happened here. Kings Mountain teaches us something simple and something powerful. The most dangerous army in the world is not the one with the best training, or the finest weapons, or the most professional soldiers. The most dangerous army is ordinary people defending their homes and refusing to stop. Thank you for watching this story on Storia English. If you enjoyed learning English through this powerful story, please subscribe to Storia English. Every week we bring you a new story from history, told in clear, slow, simple English, so you can improve your listening, your vocabulary, and your confidence, naturally, without stress. We will see you in the next story.